Okay, well, thanks Shane and Marcus and others for the invitation to present this material to you. I hope you'll find it intriguing. It may be rather different from what you've had for some of your other talks, but variety is the spice of life. As Shane said, the slides and handout are available through the chat. I'll be referring to the main handout, which has the text that we'll be looking at. The Latin is there, as we were saying, only for the hardcore who want to follow up. Okay. So I thought I should start with a slide which I've used elsewhere, sort of a generic slide for introducing people to the period in the medieval times when logic occupied a large part of university curriculum and discussion. And it all kicks off really around 1100. Up to that point, there's very little of Aristotle available in the Latin West. I've listed some of those works there of Aristotle's, but very basic stuff. But during the 12th century, between 1100 and 1200, we get what came to be known as the new logic, Logica Nova. It was old logic because it was from 2000 years earlier, or whatever, some 1500 years earlier. But that was the rest of Aristotle's logical works became more widely available in the Latin West. And that stimulated something that then became known as the logic of the moderns from about the middle of the 12th century onwards. And they started to make their own original contributions in order to explain and extend what Aristotle has been doing in his works. And a number of people have probably heard about the theory of properties of terms, which is sort of what we would now call meaning and reference and various notions like that. They developed a theory of consequences to extend and back up the theory of the syllogism that they acquired from Aristotle. There's a theory of insolubles, or as you might say, logical paradoxes, which is our topic for today, and a theory of obligations, which is a very strange genre of disputation, which we'll touch on later on today. This all reaches its fulfillment in the 14th century, which I often like to describe as the most productive century for logic, certainly before the 19th and possibly even the 20th. If you're just looking at the sheer amount of logic that was done, obviously great things were done in the 19th century, but the 14th century had a huge amount of logic going on at the time. So Paul of Venice, his work comes right at the end of the 14th century. He's born in 1369. He joins the Augustinians, who send him off to Oxford to study philosophy and theology. He comes back from Oxford excited by lots of things there, but particularly by the logic which he's been learning in Oxford, and with quite a number of texts which he brings back to Italy with him to Padua. And he then writes the small logic, Logica Parva, the big logic, Logica Magna, the Quadratura, which is the work we'll be looking at today, and then lots of other works, particularly commentaries on Aristotle's logical works and physics and Dynamo and metaphysics. So he discusses insolubles in 4 works, those 3 I've just mentioned, and also the golden sophisms. And rather strikingly, he adopts different solutions to the insolubles in two works compared with the other 2. In the first and the third, the Parva and the Quadratura, he adopts a solution similar to that of a man called William Heytesbury, who was writing at Oxford in the 1330s. And in the second and fourth, he adopts quite a different solution due to a man called Roger Swyneshed, also writing at Oxford in the 1330s. A man called Alan Pariah in modern times has spent an entire career studying Paul of Venice, and he's argued repeatedly, again and again, that because of this doctrinal difference, the Logica Magna can't be by Paul, and he gives other arguments as well. I'm running a project at the moment of editing the treatise on Insolubles from the Logica Magna, and Barbara Bartocci and I in that project, which is just about to go to press, hopefully will be published in a year or so, but we're just about to send a final copy into the press. We've argued at length, someone needs to get around to doing it, that Pariah's arguments are mistaken, and that in fact the Magna is by Paul of Venice, even though it takes a different line from that in the Parva. And one of the things we note there, which seems quite crucial to this argument, is what Paul writes at the end of the chapter on Insolubles in the Logica Parva. He says, "Notice that not everything I've said here or in other treatises have I said according to my own view, but partly according to the view of others, in order to enable young beginners to progress more easily." And the basic story is the Logica Parva is Paul preparing a teaching text for undergraduate students. The Logica Magna is a much more extensive work, which goes into a lot more detail, where he can write his own opinions. And I often like to comment that I spent many years teaching classical logic to the first years, and then giving courses on relevance logic, which is what I really believe in, to the upper level, in the upper level courses. Very similar to Paul's experience here. So here's a sophism from Paul's Quadratura. Don't be misled by the title Quadratura, which you might think is a treatise on squaring the circle, but it's not that. It's an introductory logic text. So again, falls under this this chime of, teach the curriculum, not necessarily what you believe in. It's a massive work. You could be quite intimidated if you thought that was your introductory logic text. It's about 500,000 words. It's in 4 sections. Each section contains 50 sophisms, each trying to prove some mad thesis, like, for example, that the same argument can be both valid and invalid. And that's what the example we're looking at today of one of the 50 sophisms that purport to show that the same argument can be both valid and invalid. And it seems definite that the Quadratura was presented by Paul as, although it's not quite in the same chronology, it's a bit like her Bibelschrift in a way. It's showing that you're capable of teaching, but actually in this case by doing some teaching for the curriculum. So now, as I said, the first question is about whether the same inference can be both valid and invalid, and we're going to look at the 15th chapter of the first part, which is actually called the chapter on Insolubles, where he presents a logical paradox to defend that thought. So the first thing we should do is to look through so new share, I'll share with you the handout if I can find it, that's here. Okay, so has that worked?
Yep.
Right. Not for me, it hasn't, so I'll read it from somewhere else. So maybe I can bring it, maybe I just need to bring it forward. Okay, so first doubtful question, whether the same inference can be both valid and invalid. And Paul writes this: regarding the first doubtful question, one argues like this: this inference, call it B, is valid. A will signify only that everything true will be false, so A will be false. And this inference B is invalid, so the question is true. The argument's valid, and I prove the premises. At first, the second premise. But there's a possible scenario in which the premise of inference B is true and its conclusion false, so inference B is not valid. I prove the premise. Let's assume that as long as A will exist, A will signify only that everything true will be false, and that it will be the case that everything true will be false as long as A will exist. On this assumption, the premise of B is true according to the scenario. And I prove that the conclusion of B is false because as long as A will exist, A will be true, so it will not be false. I prove the premise because as long as A will exist, it will be the case that everything true will be false. And as long as A will exist, A will signify only that everything true will be false. Therefore, as long as A will exist, A will be true. If your head's starting to reel at this point, we're going to go through this and try and track the argument in detail in ways that we might prefer. It's very back to front, as you may see. He makes a claim and then produces an argument for it. But now I prove the first premise of the argument, namely that inference B is valid because the opposite of the conclusion is incompatible with the premise, for these are incompatible. A will signify only that everything true will be false, and A will not be false. Proof, I form this syllogism. Everything true will be false, A will not be false, therefore A will not be true. This syllogism holds in Barocco. That's what do we call it? Or not exactly an acronym. Shorthand that the medievals had for referring to the form of a syllogism. It's an AOO, universal affirmative first premise, particular negative second premise, particular negative conclusion. So the syllogism holds in Barocco, so it's valid. And as long as A will exist, it will be as the premises signify. Hence, as long as A will exist, it will be as the conclusion signifies. So A will exist and will be neither true nor false, which will be impossible. This is shown in this way. A will not be false and A will exist, so A will be true as long as it will exist. Hence, I argue like this: everything true will be false, A will be true, therefore A will be false. This inference holds, and as long as A will exist, it will be as the premises signify. Therefore, as long as A will exist, it will be as the conclusion signifies, which is incompatible with the second conjunct of the conjunction composed of the premise and the opposite of the conclusion of the original inference B. So if we go back to the slides, okay, so we've read through it, our head's reeling a bit, so let's think a bit about what he's actually told us. At its heart is a self-referential proposition A, where we assume that A will signify only that everything true will be false. I mean, the obvious thought is that A is the proposition, everything true will be false. But of course, it might be some other way of expressing the same thing. This is the premise of an inference, as the medievals called it, a consequentia B, whose conclusion is that A will be false. And B argues first that B is invalid, and then that B is valid. And it follows, he says, that our overall question is true. The same inference B can be both valid and invalid. So first, let's look at what he gave second, in fact, the argument that B is valid. His argument for this is that the opposite of B's conclusion is incompatible with its premise, which seems a pretty good way of showing an argument's valid. The reason is that he takes proposition A to be equivalent to everything that is or will be true is false. Okay, so this was what was called in medieval times the doctrine of ampliation, that a future tense predicate extends or expands, ampliates the reference of the subject, or supposition as they would call it, of the subject, to both that which is and that which will be. Okay, so everything true will be false is taken to mean everything that is true will be false. I think there's a typo there. I apologize for that. I've just noticed a typo. A is in fact equivalent to everything that is or will be true will be false. Apologies for that. So it's everything that is true will be false, and everything that will be true will be false. Please correct your handouts if you have downloaded them. So the general doctrine is every S will be P is equivalent to everything that is or will be S will be P. And similarly for some S will be P, no S will be P, and so on. For example, everything white will be black is true if everything which is now white will be black, and everything which will at any future time be white will at some future time before, at, or after the other be black. In other words, if anything that is now or at some future time will be white will not also at some future time be black, the proposition everything white will be black was taken to be false. From here, the proof that B is valid is straightforward. You'll be relieved to hear that something's straightforward now. Take the contradictory opposite of the conclusion of B, that is, A will not be false. Then assuming that A exists, A will be true. Now, this is the point at which I remind people or explain to you the way in which medievals thought of propositions. They don't think of them as we would think of propositions, simply as abstract entities signified by sentences. They think of propositions as concrete token utterances which may be spoken or written or thought. So they can be of any of those three sorts. And in particular, they're concrete, they can change their values from time to time, they can cease to exist, they can not yet exist, and so on. So propositions is, propositio is being used in a much wider sense than we would use the word proposition. Okay, so assuming that A exists, or will exist, A will be true, then according to the premise, everything that will be true will be false. So if A will be true, it will be false. But our assumption was that A will not be false. So we've contradicted our assumption. So it follows that as long as A will exist, and as part of B it does exist, the premise of B is incompatible with the contradictory of its conclusion. So B is in fact valid. You may want to think about that. I see this as not exactly the same, but as rather similar to the reasoning that we find in Yablo's paradox, which I expect most of you know, but I'll remind you or introduce others to Yablo's paradox. Discovered, if that's the right word for it, by Steve Yablo about 30 years ago, early 1990s. So Yablo's paradox explicitly invokes a sequence of propositions, each referring to all subsequent propositions in the sequence. So the first one is S1, which says that for all k greater than 1, sk is untrue. And S2 says that for all k greater than 2, sk is untrue, and so on for all k, for all n, shall we say. Now suppose that for some n, Sn is true. Then for all k greater than n, sk is untrue. In particular, Sn plus 1 is untrue, and for all k greater than n plus 1, sk is untrue. But that's what Sn plus 1 says. So Sn plus 1 is also true. Contradiction. So our assumption must be false. That is, there can be no n such that Sn is true. That is, for all n, Sn is untrue. But then Yablo points out that if every n Sn is untrue, then the sentences subsequent to any Sn are all untrue, in which case Sn is true after all. And that's not just a contradiction, that's a paradox. Now, Yablo's intermediate conclusion that every Sn is untrue matches, it seems to me, Paul's intermediate conclusion that given that everything true will be false, A will not be false, and so B is valid. So far, so good. But then Paul, like Yablo, realizes that the conclusion will lead to paradox. But there's a counterexample to the validity of B. Suppose that as long as A exists, it will continue to signify that everything true will be false. But in fact, it will continue to be the case that everything true will be false. Then A will continue to be true, but B's premise will be true, and its conclusion false. Remember, the conclusion is that A will be false. But if A continues to be true, the conclusion of B is false, but nonetheless, A continues to signify that everything true will be false. And so B will have a true premise and a false conclusion. So B is invalid, but we proved that it was valid, so we have a paradox. Okay, so step back a bit and say, right, well, here is Paul at the end of the 14th century, and it's been the century of insolubles or paradox. It's remarkable the number of people who actually turned their minds to think about logical paradoxes. Not that particular one, which I don't actually know from anywhere else except Paul's Quadratura. It'd be interesting if someone else can come up with another source for it, but a whole variety of these insolubles that they look at. And there were two responses to the insolubles that dominated discussion in the 13th century, pretty much up to the early 1320s. And they go, and the title is Cessationism, which was simply to say that these self-referential utterances simply fail to say anything coherent. They get us into a paradox, and so there must be something really seriously wrong with them, and they're not really propositions at all. You may recognize this from certain 20th century responses to the paradoxes. And the other one called restrictionism, said that self-reference is strictly impossible. That is, no expression can, in their technical terms, supposit for, or in other words, refer to the whole of which it is a part. And you can take that in a broad version or a narrow version. You have a broad version which bans all self-reference. No expression can supposit for a whole of which it's part. Or you can take a narrow version, which you find in Walter Burley and William Ockham, writing in the early 14th century, that no expression can signify or supposit for a whole of which it's part, when you've got nasty terms like false or not true around, which sounds a bit ad hoc, and that was one of the objections that you might want to make to that line. But both versions extend the prohibition to propositions equivalent to the whole of which it's part, or the opposite of the whole of which it's part, or circles such as the yes-no paradox, where Plato says that what Socrates says is true, while Socrates says that what Plato says is false, and so on. And then the big sea change occurs in the early 1320s, when a man called Thomas Bradwardine, whose Insolubles I edited and translated about 10 years ago, he produced a sea change in approaches to the paradoxes. One of those changes is the sheer number of authors who then start discussing insolubles, particularly in Oxford, but also on the continent in Paris. And there were traditionalists who continued to defend restrictio and cassatio, restrictionism and cessationism. But the main discussion, the main division we'll now get is between those who are excited by Bradwardine's idea and continue to extend it and develop it, and those who were opposed to Bradwardine's central idea. So the central idea that Bradwardine had was that insolubles have some hidden meaning, some implicit, tacit meaning, in addition to what they appear on the surface to mean. And the key to that hidden signification was a postulate he presented, that if a proposition signifies itself not to be true or itself to be false, it also signifies itself to be true. And so since it signifies itself both to be not true and true, it can't be both, and so it's false. That was the key to Bradwardine's solution, was that there's this hidden meaning which makes it implicitly self-contradictory, and we get a development of this account in the man Heytesbury that I mentioned before, a man called Robert Elland, Ralph Strode, John of Holland, John Hunter, John Buridan, many people will have heard of his account, Alwyn of Saxony, Gregor Rimini, Peter of Eye, Marcellus of England. I could go on and just a whole long list of people who were excited enough by this to want to develop it But on the other hand, there was one person who stood out in particular against it, and he is a man called Roger Swyneshed that I mentioned before. Okay, so Bradwardine is much better known in the history of science and the history of theology than he is in the history of logic. He was one of the first of the Oxford calculators who did some really significant work on dynamics in almost forerunners of Newton some centuries later. But he then also went on to write a famous work, De Causa Dei, on theology. But before he got involved in all that, in his very early work in the early 1320s was this exciting treatise on insolubles that he wrote. So as I say, the success of his solution turns on the possibility of saying there are multiple meanings, there are tacit hidden meanings in these propositions. And so he needs to slightly modify the account of truth to cope with this and define a proposition as true if everything it signifies obtains. If things are wholly as it signifies, and it's false if it signifies in any way other than things are. And as I've said, there's this postulate that claims that signification is closed under consequence. So anything a proposition signifies, anything that a proposition signifies, anything that follows from anything it signifies. And then he can prove that any proposition which signifies itself to be false also signifies that it's true, and so it's simply false. For example, if Socrates says that what he says, what he says is a falsehood, and that's the only thing he says, then it's going to follow implicitly that what he says is false, and so by the postulate that what he says is true, and so it will be implicitly contradictory, and so we have a solution to what he says is simply false. Problem of revenge is one of the first things that would strike you. We want to say, or Bradwardine wants to say, that what Socrates says is false, and Socrates says that what Socrates says is false. And when Bradwardine says it, it's true, apparently, and when Socrates says it, it's false. How come? Well, two things to say about that. First one, it's not that strange that the same thing uttered by different people can have different truth values, because these things are, after all, token reflexive. But moreover, Socrates' utterance signifies not only that it itself is false, but also that it itself is true, which is contradictory, whereas Bradwardine's utterance simply says that what Socrates says is false, and there's no inference from there that what Bradwardine says, that it should signify that what Bradwardine says is true, or that what Socrates says is false. Okay, so that was Bradwardine. As I say, it's taken up by lots of people, including this man, William Heytesbury, who's another of the Oxford calculators, working in Oxford on the Insolubles about 10 years later, when Bradwardine's still there in Oxford, but he's moved on, as I say, to physics and theology by that time. And Heytesbury developed his solution to the insolubles within the context of the theory of these strange things called obligations. And these are logical obligations, which you can get into by agreeing to take part in a certain game that the medievals invented. So there's always an opponent and a respondent, and the opponent proposes a background scenario which may or not be counterfactual, but at least establishes the context for the disputation. Suppose we're in Oxford or such a thing, and that you're not a bishop, which is quite easy to suppose. Then in positio, which is the main form of obligation, there are several forms. Some proposition is proposed by the opponent, which is called the positum, and something that's usually false in the scenario. And the respondent is expected to accept the obligation to maintain the positum, providing that's not obviously impossible. But if it's obviously impossible, he's quite at liberty to reject it. And the obligation is then on the respondent, is then to respond according to the very strict rules, which we'll come to in a moment, and without contradicting himself, to answer to a series of propositions put forward by the proponent. In each case, he can either grant what the opponent said, or deny what the opponent said, or doubt. That is, he say, I don't know, in response to what the opponent says. So Heytesbury first distinguishes an insoluble scenario from an insoluble proposition. A scenario of an insoluble is one in which mention is made of some proposition, such that if in the same scenario it signifies only as words commonly suggest, from its being true it follows that it's false and vice versa. Okay, so from what appears on the surface, if it turns out that you've got a contradiction, then you're in the scenario, you're in a situation of an insoluble. And a proposition is one mention of which is made in such an insoluble scenario. Now, crucial to Heytesbury's solution to the insolubles is whether or not the opponent, when they specify the signification of the insoluble, suppose it's Socrates says, what Socrates says is false. If he says, and what he says signifies only that what he says is false, signifies precise in the Latin, then there's no way of proceeding in a consistent way at that point. The respondent should simply say, I'm not playing. That's, I'd be foolish to get involved in that one. On the other hand, if the opponent doesn't lay down that extra stipulation that that's the only thing it signifies, leaves open that there's perhaps some hidden meaning there, then Heytesbury says, yes, that's fine. In that case, you can engage in the obligation. And then when the opponent attempts to trap you in a contradiction, you should say, but there's an additional signification that the insoluble has. It will mean something extra, and that will enable me to say that, and the extra thing fails, so what the insoluble says is false. But crucially, what's the key to Heytesbury's theory is what he said, what we've got at the bottom of the screen. If someone asks what the proposition uttered by Socrates signifies in this scenario, other than that Socrates says a falsehood, the respondent doesn't have to respond to that question. This is where some people tear their hair out and say, come on, Heytesbury, give us an idea of what it is. Surely you can't just play games like that. And Heytesbury says, I'm playing a game of insolubles, game of obligations. I don't need to do that. All I need to say is there must be a hidden signification there, which gets out of the mess. Well, some people like that, other people didn't. Ralph Strode, who some of you may remember, is one of the dedicatees of Chaucer's long poem on Troilus and Crusade. He dedicates it to philosophical Strode, who he knew later on when they were living next door to one another in London in the 1380s. Strode likes some of Heytesbury's position, but he also rather favours Bradwardine's position. And so what he does is to suggest combining the two. So we get rid of all that complication in Bradwardine's position about the second postulate and what a proposition signifies is anything that follows from anything it signifies. Let's simply say that in the case of insolubles, there's an extra meaning, and it's simply that the insoluble is true. So when we haven't got that little word only, like the word precise there, when the opponent presented the insoluble, you should accept the scenario the insoluble should be granted, and you should simply deny that the insoluble is true. Okay, so when Socrates says a falsehood, that's false, and although it looks as if it should be true because it says what's the case, it also says more than what's the case. It also says of itself that it's true, and that's not the case, it's false. And so it's simply false. And there's another man, we don't know his name, so he's been dubbed pseudo-Heytesbury, which is a standard way of referring to medieval logicians. When you don't know who they are, you pick someone their theory is a bit like and say it's pseudo-Scotus or pseudo-Heytesbury or pseudo-whoever. It must be said that a falsehood exists signifies conjunctively, namely that a falsehood exists, and that very proposition is true. Because if a falsehood exists is the only proposition, then we can get a paradox. Okay, so here we have the modified Heytesbury account, modified by, among others, Strode and also by Holland and Hunter, and it became the standard doctrine presented to students at Oxford in the later 14th century, incorporated into something called the Logica Oxoniensis, which is essentially a set of teachers' handouts to students from the logic curriculum at Oxford in the later 14th century and early 15th century. And Hunter, as I say, spells out the solution. Socrates says a falsehood, and that has no other proposition, call it A. We might be tempted to argue A is false, Socrates says A, so Socrates says a falsehood. The inference is valid, the premises are true, so the conclusion is true, but Socrates says the conclusion, so Socrates says the truth. No, Hunter says, it should be denied that Socrates says the conclusion. Rather, he says another proposition, similar in sound, but not in signification, because what was said by Socrates signifies that Socrates says a falsehood, and thus that it itself is false, since Socrates says nothing else, and that it itself is true. That's the heart of the modified Heytesbury solution. But any other similar proposition which is not said by Socrates signifies only that Socrates says a falsehood, which is the answer to the problem of revenge. Okay, so that's the prevailing solution for undergraduates. Now we come to Roger Swyneshed. There are two Swinesheds, both calculators. This is the lesser known one. Richard's very well known in the history of science, working in Oxford again in the 1330s. But he wants to find a solution which doesn't mess with these hidden meanings. He wants to just take expressions at face value, so the principal signification, as he would call it, is just what it's commonly taken to be, what the words commonly suggest. And the central idea for him is that insolubles falsify themselves. That is, they imply their own falsehood. And insolubles are proposition signifying principally as things are other than things are, which is relevant to inferring itself to be false or unknown or not believed, and so on. That's enough for him for them to be false. So, for example, every proposition is false, falsifies itself, since one can validly infer that every proposition is false itself is false if it exists. You can infer that from every proposition is false. So he also needs to revise, perhaps in a rather more substantive way than in Bradwardine's case, revise the definitions of truth and falsehood. A proposition is true if it signifies principally as things are and doesn't falsify itself, and it's false if either it doesn't signify principally as things are or it does falsify itself. Then, for example, Socrates' utterance of Socrates says a falsehood falsifies itself if it's Socrates' only utterance, but although it signifies as things are, it's not true, since it falsifies itself. It's just false. And that Socrates says a falsehood is all it signifies. So that's the competing account from Swyneshed. Swineshed's theory has three rather dramatic and paradoxical consequences, which would put some people off. There's a false proposition that signifies principally as things are. There's a formally valid inference when a false follows from the true. That's a real killer. And two mutual contradictories are both false. And this proposition is false serves rather nicely to prove all these conclusions. The first one's straightforward. This proposition is false if it's the only proposition signifies as things are, because it's false, because it falsifies itself. So it's immediate in that case. The second one is perhaps a bit more interesting. This proposition is false, so this proposition is false, where this refers in both cases to the conclusion. Okay, so the premise and conclusion say the same thing of the conclusion, namely that it's false. While the conclusion's clearly false, because it says of itself that it's false, it falsifies itself. And the premise is true, because it truly says of the conclusion that it's false. But it's also clearly valid, since if exactly the same thing is stated in the premise and the conclusion. And finally, this proposition is false and this proposition is not false are contradictories. One denies what the other asserts, but the first is false since it falsifies itself, while the second is false since it falsely says that the first is not false. Might want to come back to that in discussion. Okay, so Paul's first solution, the one in the Quadratura, sticks very much to the modified Heytesbury solution. So following the text which we've given you, where that was simply where he sets out the sophism, he then goes on, as I've said, well, I meant to say anyway, he then presents four conclusions. That's the whole point. Whole point about the pun Quadratura is it's all fours. So there's four conclusions, there's four parts, there's four corollaries, there's the rule of four everywhere. And the second conclusion says there's a proposition signifying principally purely predicatively, which at some time will signify principally in a compound way. Nonetheless, there'll be no change in it, nor will any new imposition be added to it. And the example he gives is every proposition is false. At the moment, every proposition is false is simply signifies that every proposition is false. Suppose at some time, however, that it becomes the only proposition there is. All the other propositions are annihilated by God, who's usually the person who steps in at this point to help set up rather extravagant scenarios. God abolishes all other propositions. Every proposition is false now becomes an insoluble, but insolubles have this conjunctive compound signification. At that point, every proposition is false now suddenly also signifies of itself that it's true. So it suddenly changes its signification. So when it will be the only proposition, it will signify principally that every proposition is false and that it's true, just like other insolubles whose significations reflect wholly on themselves. And he reiterates that point about adopting the modified Heytesbury solution in the third conclusion. It's possible for every proposition to be false and for every proposition is false to signify exactly that every proposition is false. And here the point is that he's distinguishing the principal signification, which is the conjunction of every proposition is false and this proposition is true, from the exact signification, which is what it commonly suggests, was the phrase we had before, simply that what's on the surface, every proposition is false. So normally it signifies just that every proposition is false. When it's the only proposition, it signifies conjunctively that together with the claim that itself is true. So, time to turn to Paul's solution to the temporal insoluble that we looked at the beginning. And here his idea is B is indeed valid for the reason given that the the opposite of the conclusion is incompatible with the premise, but the scenario that was described, which purported to show that the premise could be true and the conclusion false, fails. So the argument he gave was, assume that as long as A will exist, A will signify only that everything true will be false, and then it will be the case that everything true will be false as long as A will exist. On that assumption, it was claimed in the Sophism, the premises of B is true according to the scenario. Not so, because the whole point about the modified Heytesbury solution is that when you have an insoluble scenario and an insoluble proposition, the insoluble has an extra meaning. And so the premise of B will fail to be true because the premise says A will signify only that everything true will be false. And at that point, A will actually also signify something else as well. And so we can accept that the argument B is valid, but deny that there is any scenario in which the premise is true and the conclusion false, because if the conclusion ever was false, you'd get into an insoluble scenario, in which case the premise would fail because you get this extra meaning. How long would you say I have now? I think I'm going to have to skip one or two things that are coming up.
I'd say you got about 10 minutes left.
Right, okay. That's predicated on the fact that what we have here is an insoluble. And then I have a little bit of discussion about whether or not, or what counts as an insoluble in this particular situation. And basically, it's that a proposition is sort of, if it falsifies, if you get a contradiction from the scenario in which it's embedded. If in that scenario it follows that it's both true and false, then that proposition is an insoluble. So we've seen the solution. The first solution, the solution actually in the Quadratura itself. What I thought was interesting was, since Paul actually goes on in his Logica Magna to reject that solution and adopt a different solution, to see, well, can the other solution, can Swyneshede's solution also deal with the temporal paradox, and how would it do it? And in the Logica Magna, Paul discusses a range of insolubles, but not this one, as it happens. So it's an interesting exercise to do this. The definition of insoluble comes here following Swyneshed in a narrow and a broader view. The narrow one is one that Paul himself gives explicitly in the Logica Magna, which is an insoluble proposition is a proposition having reflection on itself, wholly or partially implying its own falsity, or that it itself is not true. Insoluble is a self-falsifying proposition. That's the simple story. There's a broader definition, which is the one that Swyneshed himself gives, which is it's one that either falsifies itself or shows of itself that it's unknown, or shows of itself that it's not believed, and so on, and extends it. And at the moment, it seems to me that Paul himself gets a bit confused about whether he wants to treat these other insolubles as insolubles and broaden the definition, or treat them not as insolubles, but say of them, although they're not insolubles, nonetheless, they're unknown or not believed, and so on. And an example is that it's quite interesting to look at in the fourth conclusion of Logica Magna. He says there's a formally valid inference known by you to be so, signifying exactly by the composition of its parts, where the premise is known by you, that the conclusion is not known by you. And there's a variation on something we saw just now. It's not quite the Noah paradox, which I think is just the conclusion of this. This I would dub the inferential Noah paradox. This is unknown to you, therefore this is unknown to you, where each occurrence of this refers to the conclusion. For the premise is known by you because you know that the conclusion is not known, since it's an insoluble that implies that it itself is unknown. If you're familiar with the Noah paradox, you'll know that if you assume that the proposition "this is unknown to you" is known by you, then you can infer that it's unknown by you. And indeed, if it's unknown by you, then it's true, and you've proved it, so you do know it. So you're into a paradox. But if you have a solution saying no, it's simply unknown for whatever reason, and that's it, that's enough, it's not known, then the premise is known by you because you know that the conclusion is unknown. Now that fourth conclusion, denial of logical omniscience, actually seems quite attractive to some people. They think, well, yes, there are many cases where I know the axioms of some theory, I know the rules of inference, but I don't know all the consequences of those axioms. But that's more a matter of psychology than what lies behind the fourth conclusion. And that comes out particularly in the fifth conclusion, which is the one we actually saw as Swineshed's second paradoxical conclusion, that there are inferences that are valid and formally valid, he says, when a premise is true and the conclusion is false. And then there's the possibility that you treat them as merely apparent insolubles, but we'll leave that aside. So what we need to do is now come to everything true will be false is false, not necessarily because something true will be false, and indeed that would satisfy it, but even when everything true will be false, it will be false because it falsifies itself. So whether we class the temporal paradox as insoluble or not, it will be false if things are as it signifies. Or if things are not as it signifies, then it's false. So either it's false or it will be false. So to sum up, Paul offers two diagnoses of the sophism. In the Quadratura, he says B is valid, and the purported counterexample fails because the premise would be false if the conclusion were true. Sorry, if the conclusion were false, the premise would be false, which is the sort of logician's answer. While in the Logica Magna and the Sophisms of Aria, where he presents his own Swyneshed-inspired solution, whatever you do as you treat it insoluble or not, again, he's going to say B is valid because the opposite of the conclusion is inconsistent with the premise. But it is indeed possible for the premise to be true and conclusion false. And that's rather an alarming, it seems to me, outcome that you might have at that point, because you could have a sequence of perfectly valid steps leading you from truth to falsehood, and so it would seem that we can prove falsehoods, and so the concept of proof goes out the window. And there's, by way of a summary of what I presented, Paul of Venice, two different solutions to the Insolubles. They illustrate major lines of approach to Insolubles in the 14th century leading up to his time, that following Bradwardine and that following Swyneshed. There's the modified Heytesbury solution, which dominates the curriculum in Oxford. And then we have Swyneshed presenting this idea of insolubles simply falsifying themselves and being false for that reason. And then we get this sophism in Paul's Quadratura, and we can see the two different ways in which he's going to solve it. And if you want to follow up on this at all, there are some references. Thank you.